Have you ever watched a recorded or live performance and been totally convinced by the actor or actress's accent, even though it differs from their native or home accent? I'm thinking Gwyneth Paltrow in Shakespeare in Love for me. Well, this is what we're discussing this week, inviting back Louisa Morgan to the podcast to discuss what accents and dialect really means, how we can understand the mapping of an accent to both teach singers who do not share the same accents as us, or to help a performer take on an accent for a role. What are the challenges when a singer has to speak script in an accent and then follow through into song in a particular style? What ethical considerations do we need to make in this work? And what is the role of stereotypes? We talk about things like the International Phonetic Alphabet, and Louisa also takes us through the start of an exercise to help us try on a certain accent in our own mouths. Louisa Morgan, welcome back to the podcast. Louisa, it's so lovely to welcome you back. What have you been up to since we last chatted?
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It's really nice to be back, and it's really nice to be chatting to you again because it's been quite a while since we've seen each other. But what have I been up to? Well, I now work at the Voice Study Centre. I've been there a little over a year. I'm the spoken voice lead now, which comes with lots of new and interesting responsibilities. I'm in the early stages of my PhD, so I'm doing that with the Guildford School of Acting. Yeah, so I'm very much in the kind of putting everything together phase of that. I have an article which is currently in publication, and I'm running lots of courses.
Amazing. So busy.
Busy, busy. Yes, always.
Remind us what your PhD is focusing on.
So basically, all of my research that I do is about emotion. That's kind of where I frame everything. That's either within the spoken voice or the sung voice. My PhD specifically is about emotion and acting through song, but I'm also writing a paper about emotion and accents and dialects. I'm also writing one about emotion in non-verbal vocalizations in gaming, in computer gaming. So anything that's to do with emotion, I'm interested.
And that's what you came on to talk about in our first chat, wasn't it? And now I've dragged you back for accents and dialects. So thank you so much for coming back. What are we actually talking about when we discuss accents versus dialect?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because I think there's a technical answer and then there's how we actually use the terminology. And I think the UK differs slightly from the US based on conversations I've had with colleagues over there. Technically, from a sort of linguistics background, understanding rather, what we know is that accents should be about pronunciation. So it's actually about how we produce those particular sounds to make that accent. It sometimes also gets used to describe the sounds of a language, so the pronunciation of a language compared to smaller geographical regions where dialect would be used. But actually, on a technical level, dialect should be more to do with the syntax, the grammar, the vocabulary choices. So rather than accent being something like the difference between bath and bath, dialect might be something to do with saying ain't instead of am not, or even amn't in some cases. And then we also have things like idiolects. So idiolects is to do with your own individual sounds that you make. So that's everything that comes together to form how you speak the words that you speak.
I'm a really big lover of 19th century novels, whether that's the classics, your Brontes, or whether it's a contemporary writer writing historical language. And so it's really interesting to read those dialects. And you mentioned the word amant and picking up on those things. So without going into too much of a history lesson and going off piste, I know we're quite different across all the different regions, but how has that progressed and why? Why does it change?
Yeah, well, I think what you've picked up on there is really, really interesting. And for me, as someone who my first degree was, I have a few.
Yeah, you're collecting them.
Was in English literature before I went into the performing arts. So my first degree was English and literary studies. And I also love the Brontes. And of course, they're Yorkshire. And there are some really interesting features of the Yorkshire dialect that date back a very, very, very long time because of the way that there wasn't so much interference in the language that was being developed. So we see sort of throwbacks, if you like, to even kind of Germanic influences. And we also see that in areas like what would be West Saxon. So down in like the Southwest and areas like that, we see some of these kind of throwbacks of this Germanic influence that are really, really interesting. So you get influences from history based on kind of things that happen in the geography, but you also have influences from things like trade. And if you think about areas like New Orleans, which is such a port, it's such an interesting mix of accents and dialects in that area because of the influence of the different people coming in and out of it all the time. And I think people are often, who are not based in the UK, people are often really surprised how many very, very different accents and dialects we see in the UK. I'm in South Wales at the moment, and you can hear the difference in the Rhondda Valley, which is where I am, just in this particular town compared to, I would say, maybe 40 minutes, like less than 40 minutes away. You can hear pretty big differences. And of course, I'm in a valley. So that geographical difference is, for a long time will have had a big impact on compared to the city in Cardiff, which is 45 minutes drive away from me. But also just thinking about the literary influence there, when we look at something like the Brontes and we're seeing the Yorkshire and they're bringing in those dialects, sometimes those are written in a way that we understand it now to be connected to the way that we hear it now. But of course, dialects that are written centuries ago, we didn't have the IPA then. We didn't have the International Phonetic Alphabet. So we have to try and work out what that was supposed to sound like in the way that they've written it. So there are so many kind of levels of interpretation there, which are really, really interesting.
Do you have a favorite Bronte novel?
I'm afraid I am an Emily girl, so I'm very much Wuthering Heights. Yes. And if I look up right now, I can see a poster of Jane Eyre. I can see a poster of Wuthering Heights, but I also absolutely love Anne's novel, which nobody really talks about.
Oh, always thinking Tennant of Wildfell Hall.
Yes, we are. Yes.
Love it. Love it. I purposely saved that book last year for autumn because I felt like it was a good read for when the leaves were falling. I think it's really underrated.
Massively, massively.
Anyway, we digress. In your experience, what are some of the easier versus more challenging accents and dialects for actors, performers to learn and maintain through a performance?
If I answered that for me personally, I would probably say something along the lines of Scottish. Obviously, Scotland is a country, but any of the Scottish accents and dialects I find particularly challenging. But the reason I find that challenging is because of how different it is from my home sounds that I make. So what that is for you will be dependent on the home sounds and positions that your body is used to making. Even if we take a sound like S, like a S sound, depending on who you are individually, where you are from geographically, but also just how you learned to copy that sound as a child, you will probably either put the tip of the tongue up on the gum ridge, on the alveolar ridge, and make a S sound, or you will put it on your bottom teeth and make a S sound, or you will bunch it slightly at the sides and make a S sound. So those are just three ways that you could produce that one sound that realistically don't have an awful lot to do with your geographical location. We do know that in some Asian languages, people who produce that sound typically make it with the tip of the tongue down. People over here are more likely to put it up on the alveolar ridge, but not necessarily. So yeah, some of it is to do with your home accent, your home dialect, but primarily it's about how you yourself individually have learned to make that sound. And I think the important thing about what you've said there is to do with this idea of maintaining over a course of a production, because it is physically tiring to make the body, specifically the tongue, especially perhaps the lips, but especially the tongue, to produce those sounds that are in a different position than we do naturally. So stamina is a really important part of preparing the voice for maintaining throughout production. So whichever accents or dialects are going to be challenging for you will be the ones that are furthest away from your home positions. And if we think about the tongue, probably the reason why I find a lot of Scottish accents particularly difficult is because I always found rolling my R's really challenging. I can do it. I'm pretty good at it now, but I never found it came to me easily. And I remember my singing teacher as a teenager when we were singing Italian pieces, drilling me and drilling me and drilling me in front of the mirror to make my tongue behave itself. And so I think agility and flexibility are two things that you can really work on to make sure that the tongue has so many muscles involved in it, and we can move it in sections and we can move it as a whole. So to make sure that we have the stamina in preparation to be able to maintain something for the course of a whole production, we need to be doing those drills, finding that flexibility. And also, really importantly, in terms of vocal health, we need to be making sure that we're cooling down at the end and resetting.
What's an accent that you would say is particularly tonguey or backed in the tongue, a bit of anterior posterior narrowing or something like that?
Again, sorry to be vague, but again, it will slightly depend. There are accents that do tend towards certain sounds, obviously. But this is one of the reasons I know you wanted to ask me about placement, was one of the things that you mentioned. But this is one of the reasons why that gets so sticky, is because your interpretation of placement is going to be slightly different than mine, because your anatomy is different than mine, and your perception of where things feel in your anatomy are different than mine. So for me, what feels like a backed tongue position on something, maybe I would find that in like a Yorkshire. If or actually I went Manchester there, but if I if I took it back, and that might give me a little bit more of that sound, I'm probably going to be pulling that back a little bit. The Yorkshire is a little bit more dropped out, so we're getting more of the pharyngeal, but I'm still pulling the tongue back, right? But that's how I'm producing the sound. There's always more than one way to produce a sound. I mean, even if we just come to this idea of making a bright sound, is that bright because we are using twang, whatever you mean by twang? Is it bright because there are certain other features? Is it the position of the mouth? Are we spreading the lips? Is it because of the position of the tongue? So there are so many perceptual qualities there that make that kind of thing really muddy. If I were approaching an accent and I were using something like a vowel chart, which I almost always will, where we plot the position of the tongue within that vowel chart, we would probably be listening to the accent or the dialect and saying, okay, well, we think that the tongue is here. Let's try that in your voice, because for me, it feels like here. For you, we might need to shuffle that slightly further forward, because actually of your perception of that, or your production of that, or because of where your home base is. So we're always balancing these different elements to make sure that the target accent is relative to both your physical movement and your perceptual understanding of it.
If somebody is really good at one particular accent, but they really struggle with another one because of a particular shaping of the oral cavity or something, can it point towards technical issues?
Yeah, totally. And I think I would hesitate to call it a technical issue, but it's a technical challenge, if you like, in the sense that you recognize that that is their default position, and we have to be able to get them to move from A to B. If we're seeing that in their home accent, then we know that that standard setting is going to need to be adjusted. If I give you an example of a student that I had last year who has a Scottish accent, and he has a particularly sort of backed Scottish accent and sits in his fry a lot. So he sits right down, he pulls the tongue back, and there's a lot of gravel to the sound. He does not find that tiring. It is not an unpleasant sound for him or for anybody who's listening to him. It's not a problem in his speech. But in his singing, a lot of the work we then had to do was about pulling everything up and forward, not just because that's the target of the sound that we're going for in the song, but also it's about him being able to manage how different that is from his standard setting.
In an episode where we spoke with Kerry Obert, she described the sometimes sort of sweeping statement that the American accent is twangy. Equally, when we spoke to Gia Morgan, who recently expatriated to Bali, she expressed working with lots of singers from different countries and cultures and talking about working with Russian singers and people from lots of different places. How can we understand sort of like the breakdown of accents and how they are thought to be so we can get to grips with them in our own home base?
Yeah, I think the twangy American thing is something that in the UK has been around as this kind of general perception for a long time, and you can see it in old newspaper articles, and we see it in old movies and things, and it's often really derogatory. It's often considered part of this kind of loud, brash Americans who are, they're so twangy and they're obnoxious and all of this kind of thing. So yeah, I think that we need to examine that bias of the twang. Are we actually hearing twang, or is this an association that we have that has come through our culture in this country? Not we personally necessarily, not you personally, not me personally, but through our culture. So I think the word twang is not something that people very often ascribe to their own voices, but will often ascribe it to other people's voices. And whenever that happens, I think it always makes us, or it should make us pause and say, if we don't want that label, do we want to give that to somebody else? But obviously, there are certain sounds in American, I mean, America is huge. Let's just get that out there as well. America is huge. And we're also using this term American as if that's not an entire continent. And what we should be saying is North American rather than American generally. And then we come to something called General American, which is this standardized, made up thing. It doesn't quite exist in the same way that RP is this sort of standardized, made up thing. Cultivated accent, if you like. So do we hear certain features in that maybe we associate with what we might consider twanginess? And twanginess, of course, for those of us who are singing teachers as well, we have a very specific understanding of that. So it gets very convoluted when we start thinking about what the average person on the street thinks of twang and what we're talking about twang in terms of the voice. So I think, first of all, it's important to think about that bias, but then also, what are we trying to identify there that is useful? Are we trying to identify the fact that their tongue is in a different position and therefore we're finding a certain brightness? Possibly. We also know that we tend to hear more brightness in the sound when we spread the lips wider. Are we hearing different jaw setting? Are we hearing different lip setting? And that will depend on the specific region and the specific person as well. So in terms of sort of Kerry's observation about being given this label, I think there are those kind of two elements, like what are we hearing that's actually useful when we're coming to talk about accents, and then what is unhelpful and is actually just a stereotypical label. Obviously, I've talked a bit already about that sort of muddy idea of placement. But in terms of how we actually break down an accent, when we talk about placement in terms of voice coaching, you'll often hear a couple of different terms. So you might hear something called zoning. And zoning is originally Eda Sharp and Jan Hayden Rolls. They're highly respected accent dialect coaches. Originally, I think at least one of them was certainly teaching at the Royal Central School. I don't know if it was both of them, but they've written a series of books that are on pretty much every syllabus across the UK acting courses, and they talk about zoning. So they've got these 7 zones that basically work from sort of front to back in the vocal tract and then back up to the nose. So we start at the lips, we go back through the alveolar ridge, then the hard palate, and then the uvula and soft palate, and then the pharynx, and they go into nasopharynx, and then zone 7 is in the nasal cavity. So it kind of does this sort of C shape. And so they talk about giving an accent a zone rather than a placement. Is kind of the same thing, but it's quite a specific bracketive space. Obviously, we're still articulating within that, so we're going to move away and out of and back to, but that's its home base in the way that they use it. In the same way that placement is not always useful for every person or will need to be adjusted for some people, I find the same thing with zoning. So when I'm coaching with zoning, I often have to say, this is where it feels for me. Where does it feel for you? And then I'll listen very closely and see how we feel that is connecting to the target accent. And we might need to kind of okay, so that's where that sounds for you. That's where this feels for you. Do we want to just try nudging it forward? Let's try nudging it back a bit. So those are quite nice ways of putting it into a specific block. I'm not going to use the word place, block within the vocal tract to kind of focus into one area. And the nice thing about this sort of way of approaching accent coaching is that we're not breaking everything down to the minutiae of tiny little phonemes and every single sound, which, if you have a year and you're seeing that person a couple of times a week, great, you can do that and you can really thoroughly get into that. But often you've got a few sessions to learn an accent or a dialect. So if we can get there a bit quicker by using something like this to help them feel this general sense, then that's really helpful. So that's the zoning. And then the other thing that I probably slightly more than that is actually oral posture. And they talk about that quite a lot in the Knight Thompson speech work approach to accents and dialects. And they use this term listening with your mouth, which I really, really like. And because I often, when I'm listening to accents, as me just in my car listening to the radio and I know nobody else is listening to me, I will parrot along to the people who have got juicy accents that I really want to try out in my mouth. So I really identify with that phrase, listening with your mouth. But they talk about oral posture, and it's definitely something that I use a lot, which we might say in a session, okay, we're going to watch a video. And we're going to watch a video of this particular type of accent. We've got a couple of different speakers. What do we see that is common between those different speakers with no sound on? So are we seeing the same sort of jaw movement? Are we seeing similar sort of lips? What are they doing? Are they pulling the corners of their lips down? Are they lifting them up? Are we seeing any kind of clenching anywhere? For example, there's a Brooklyn accent on something that my husband watches, and I absolutely love watching his mouth because he has this brilliant, fantastic, high-pitched Brooklyn accent, and he has this constant sort of square, pouty lips the whole time. So, what can we find by just observing the mouth? And of course, we can't do that on just one person. That wouldn't be sufficient. But if we're seeing commonalities across different speakers, then we can start to say, okay, this oral posture seems to be a feature of that accent. That's really useful, and that can hook us in really quickly to that accent without us having to, like I say, go through every tiny phoneme and using all the IPA markings, especially if we have someone who doesn't work well with that.
I bet you're a bloody nightmare to watch a TV program with, Louisa.
Yes, I
I
am.
bet you're like, if you're parroting and mouth listening, I can imagine your husband's like, Louisa, just sit back and watch it.
Yeah, I'm pretty bad for that, but I do mostly do it on my own.
When you are coaching a performer to speak their speeches, their monologues within that new targeted accent, what is the carryover when they're then singing in that same character, that same accent, with the same sort of dialect, with then a vocal technique on top of that?
Yeah, that's when it becomes particularly challenging because we've got so many influences here. If it's musical theatre, let's just start with that because that's when that's most likely to happen. We're having to move from something that we're hoping is very authentic to the character, to the world that the character is in. So we want that to be as authentic as possible to that character. Before we even get to the singing, we're already juggling a number of things. We're juggling the fact that that accent is different from the performer's home base. So that's that kind of initial hurdle. Another hurdle is going to be whether that actually even matches what the director is looking for, because that's often a negotiation. And then we have this additional feature, which people often get very concerned about intelligibility. So the director has a lens on that. The voice coach has a lens on that. So there's this battle going on before we even add singing into the mix. I say battle, that was a little bit adversarial, but you know what I mean. There are these challenges going on for the performer. And then we move into singing. And I think the first thing, which I always think is worth pointing out, it sounds really obvious, but none of us speak like we sing anyway. Nobody sustains vowels for that long in our speech. We always modify our speech when we sing to some degree anyway. So I think we get very caught up in trying to make it sound continuous, but there's always going to be some need for modification to some degree. We then have this layer of what do we do to kind of balance what we want the sound to be like for the sustain. It's usually the sustains, right? Because the consonants, we to some degree we can kind of do what we like to make it authentic to the accent. Vowels are where we're worrying about making sure that we're balancing the sound production quality that is appropriate for the genre, that is appropriate for the character, that is aesthetically pleasing in the way that we want it to be, or not in the way that we want it to be, depending on the character. And then we have to deal with the accent as well. And if we take, for example, something like the rhotic R, so let's say we're basing something in an American accent and we know we've got to deal with this rhotic R. If we have, well, firstly, there are two different ways that we could produce that rhotic R. There's the tongue curl back, so we've got the retroflex tip of the tongue pulling back, which is what most people go towards. And then we have the straight back bunch with the tongue, so that we can also make the same, roughly the same sound by bunching the tongue immediately back. So firstly, we need to figure out which one the singer is doing, which one is more helpful, which one interferes less. Generally, I find that the straight back one actually interferes less because it's a less dramatic movement. It's going to interfere with the acoustics slightly less, and it's going to get back to where it needs to be next a little bit quicker, usually. But like I said, often they will go for the retroflex first. That's what I would want to check first of which one they're doing. But because we have something called R coloration, which is where the rhotic R colors the sound, the vowel sound. And when we're not used to, and I mean, you do hear it with American singers, especially American singers when the accent is kind of embraced. Like if we think about bluegrass or country or something like that, they don't mind that R coloration. It's kind of part of the sound. But if we're not looking for that, often when we've got British actors who are needing to find that rhotic R, but they don't want it to interfere with the colour of the vowel, what we have to really work on is making sure that the vowel is sustained open for as long as possible, and then work with them to find that rhotic R very quickly and then move away from it as quickly as we can as well. So it's always about the balance between finding the authenticity of the accent, finding what we need for the singer, maintaining the intelligibility, but seeing where the boundaries are. So where is the end boundary of that sound that we're looking for, and where are we moving to next, and how do we get that transition between the two? So that's just kind of one example of where it might interfere with the singer and how you might work with it. But like I said, I think starting from the position of we don't speak like we sing anyway, so kind of allowing ourselves to modify that accent slightly for when we need to, giving ourselves permission for that, I think is helpful. If we were singing something like CCM or pop, I think then the job for the singing teacher is to say, well, if they have a really strong, I mean, that's not a particularly helpful term anyways, it's strong accent, but a noticeable, let's say, accent, and they're a CCM or pop singer, well, authenticity is of the utmost in CCM and pop, and a unique, authentic sound should be the priority. So how much do we actually just say, well, this is part of your sound, why would we want to change it?
Pardon my ignorance if this is not a thing. I can imagine this being maybe slightly more challenging when it comes to legit musical theatre because of that very specific, classically leaned, warm tone. I'm thinking of Oklahoma. They've got that American accent of the region, the regional accent, but then the songs are quite warm and shapely.
I do think that is the case, but I think we also have to kind of give the audience some credit in the sense that, again, we're already suspending our disbelief about the fact that they're singing and dancing. And everything is happening in a way that does not happen naturally. This is not kitchen sink drama, you know? So I think there's an element of saying, well, we know that we want this sound production this leaning towards Western classical sound production when we're looking at legit. So we're going to have to travel further away from those accents and dialects that we want to hear in their speech. But perhaps and of course, this is where we get this idea of sort of leading characters and character roles being allowed to have a little bit more of an accent as well, because we allow it to influence the sound historically a little bit more. But also, if we do want to maintain a bit more, at least, of the sound, what can we use and what is too far? So again, it's that negotiation, but perhaps we just try the oral posture and we drop everything else. Perhaps we just try marking 2 or 3 moments where the pitch drops into a more of a speech-like range, and we can pop something back in for a moment just to remind the listener that's who we're listening to, and then letting it drop away. But part of the kind of identifying features of legit are those sustained vowels. So of course we're going to have to prioritize those, and is the legato. So we're going to have to think about that with the approach to consonants. But we already have to balance that with making sure that we're prioritizing the lyric, because of course in classical singing, that it's less important that we hear the story. Don't kill me, but it's less important. But in musical theatre, it's of the utmost importance that we hear the story. So there's already a balance going on there. So perhaps we can use it to bring the story back in at the moments where it's acceptable to.
Hey you! If you're enjoying the Singing Teachers Talk podcast, then don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We are committed to bringing you engaging conversations and valuable insights from experts across the field of voice. By subscribing, it means we can continue to do that. You'll never miss an episode, and you'll be helping to spread the word to other singing teachers, vocal coaches, and overall voice nerds. So subscribe to this channel now and just watch your teaching grow. What are some of the biggest challenges that singing teachers might face when working with a singer, one-to-one maybe, without needing to target something for a performance, but whose accent differs from their own when it comes to actually functional training?
In the same way that I would approach most aspects of actual accent and dialect coaching, in the sense that I think the first port of call is to make sure that you, as the teacher yourself, before you even get in the room with somebody else, know exactly what your home positions are. So making sure that you're really clear what your own sounds are, how you produce them yourself in your body. Not just generally, I know that when people produce this sound, they do this, but really, really intimately knowing your own positioning and structure and settings and how you learn vocally. And I don't mean in terms of in your listening, but how you learn in your mouth, how you learn in your vocal tract. Do you find that when you listen to some singers, you get a sore throat because you feel like they are squeezing? There are some teachers who feel that. Do you feel like you automatically have an idea of whether or not the sound they produce is healthy? Lots of teachers will make assumptions about that. And I would say to those teachers, you may be right, but you might not be, because it might just be that if you were to produce that sound that you're hearing, that's the reaction, that's how you would make it, because that's your response to it in your physiology, in your body. You don't know, you don't have a camera down then to be able to identify exactly how they're producing those sounds. So I think it's really important to observe that in ourselves as teachers, because we do respond to, we're using all of our senses as teachers. We all want to be really responsive in ways that are really trying to get into understanding how our client is producing what they're producing. But until you have those conversations and really get into it with them, you don't really know. So I think that's a good place to start, is how do you produce the sounds that you produce? Then when they get into the room and you notice that they have this accent or this dialect that is very, very different from yours, starting from a point of, okay, let's not even think about the target yet, which whatever that target may be, and it might not be anything to do with accent and dialect. It might just, like you say, to do with functional targets. But you need to then go from, if I were to produce the sounds that you are producing in the way that you're producing them, where would I need to move my articulators? And really trying to put yourself into that position. And when you do, you can start to go, okay, I know that this person produces that sound by moving their tongue in this way. I know that They don't put the very, very tip of the tongue on the alveolar ridge when they produce a T. They actually use the blade of their tongue. That's a really important thing for a singing teacher to be aware of. So maybe before I even do anything else, I need to spend a bit of time with them, seeing if that's just their default position or if they even have good functional movement and can choose to do that or not. So I think it's about starting with where are you, then really taking them on a case by case basis of where they are and helping yourself to feel all of those movements and understand those positions so that you can help them functionally. And I know most singing teachers do this to some degree, but I think you can do it much more forensically than a lot of people give themselves time to do. And I think if you are somebody who is working with an accent that you think may be interfering, that would be a really nice approach. Is let's break this down and work this out together. Let's stand in front of a mirror together. What do you see when I do this? What do I see when you do this? Let's make a note of that.
For example, if we think we're hearing somebody who has, let's go with the APN, a bit of a backward placed tongue when they speak, we could maybe use a bit of negative practice or working around and seeing if they have other options to know where feels like home. I guess the negative practice can do that actually, can't it? In terms of where on that sliding scale of really extreme pull back and really forward, does it feel like you're more towards home? And often they'll go, oh, it feels more like home when I've got my tongue further back.
Exactly. And you're not just helping them find out, but you're also helping yourself find out for them. As in, I know now that this is exactly where they are at this point, so that I can identify that when that comes up more regularly in other types of singing. And it might help them to just kind of go, okay, every time I make that sound, my speech is fine. There's nothing wrong with my speech. But if I'm singing this particular thing in this particular style, I know that I need to move my tongue that little bit further into this position. But I think that kind of, like I said, forensic breaking down is a really useful approach.
What ethical considerations do you bring into your work, especially around avoiding stereotypes? I know we touched a little bit on it with the American assumptions, but making sure we're not appropriating or caricaturing.
This is a really, really big and important topic, definitely. The first thing I would say is stereotypes and biases exist. There's no point ignoring them or saying, oh no, I don't have any, because they're so part of our culture, like the twangy American thing. So I think the first thing that I will do with people when I introduce a new accent, let's say I'm introducing an accent to a class, I will say, this is the accent that we're going to listen to. I'll usually play a clip and I'll say, I want you to write down everything that you think about this accent, even if it comes to your mind and you think, oh, I shouldn't say that, just write it down. Nobody else is going to see it, because it's best to acknowledge them in order to be able to examine them and then let them go. I think that's so important. I think, especially for me, having grown up in the Midlands, not that you can hear it in my voice anymore, sadly, I've lost all remnants of that now, but I was very much brought up around people saying things like the Birmingham accent, they hate that sound, it makes you sound unintelligent or whatever. So I'm very aware of how damaging that can be. We all know as singing teachers how damaging it can be when people say, oh, you sound like the cat screaming or whatever. I feel like throwaway comments to most people until we start to go, well, actually, no, these aren't throwaway comments, because this is part of who we are as people. Our voice is us. So I think examining those biases that we have, even without wanting to face them, is so important. So I will ask them to write them all down and then to sit with them for a little while and say, which of these actually come from something that is useful? Because some of them might be stereotypes, or I'm going to avoid the biases for a second, but stereotypes perhaps that are connected to something like, let's say we talk about the Somerset accent and we think, okay, rural. The whole of Somerset is not rural. Bristol is in Somerset. So is that useful to your character that you're going to be working on? Maybe, if it's relevant. What we don't want to do is to fall into the trap. There was a kind of general thing that was said a lot for a while, which is if you're from a rural area, you speak slower, and if you're from a city, you speak faster. Well, we know that that's nonsense now. So that's where the boundary creeps in. So is it useful to be aware of rural maybe giving someone a sense of space in themselves, in their body, in a way that maybe we don't get from somebody who's grown up in a city? Is there an edge or a softness, something like that? But we don't want it to influence us in a way that is actually just incorrect. If it's something like, oh, I need to slow my speech down because it's rural, then it's a problem. So sitting and examining the biases and stereotypes and saying, is there anything here that's actually useful to me? And then saying, is there anything here that I am just ready to let go of? And then just going, okay, now we can listen. Now we're going to listen to the sound again, and we're going to observe, and we're going to just park the rest of that. Now that we've addressed it, we're going to listen with fresh ears and address that free of that. I think there's also an important ethical consideration when it comes to, should I even be saying these sounds, making these sounds? Is this accent appropriate for me to either speak or coach? And I think this is a really important place where we need to lead by example. So we may be asked as coaches to work on an accent that we don't feel is appropriate for us. Maybe it's because there's not much budget to hire someone else and you happen to be the person they know, or you already work for the institution or whatever. If we say, no, this isn't appropriate, please hire someone else, here are a list of recommendations, then it gives the performer the confidence to be able to say, I also shouldn't be speaking this accent. We can't say that to them. We can't say, you shouldn't be speaking this. That's not for us to say, to professional performers especially. Obviously, it's probably different with students, but what we can do is lead from the front and say, no, this is not appropriate for me to be working with. So I think there's the biases and the stereotypes part, and then there's also the what should I even be working with part. When it comes to stereotypes, sometimes they are helpful. Sometimes it's a way into an accent. Not all of them, obviously, but sometimes we can use a stereotype. Let's say it's Italian hand gestures. Well, that might be useful to help something in our body to help us into an accent. But then we say, okay, now am I doing that just because I'm doing it, or is it actually got anything to do with my character, and is it part of me now? It's just constantly examining these things, I think, is really, really important.
Can you tell us about the IPA and how us singing teachers can get to grips with it? Because there are a lot of sounds to understand and shape.
Yes, there are a lot of sounds, and it can be really, really overwhelming. Obviously, for a lot of people who come from a classical background, lots of them may be familiar with it. People who are not from a UK background, let's say from other areas of Europe, are often already familiar with it because they often use it in language teaching in ways that we are not very good at in the UK. But if we are new to it, if we have no experience with it and we want to just start using it, I would suggest starting with the vowel quadrilateral, because for singing teachers especially, that's actually where the majority of our work is likely to be focused to begin with. Although the symbols themselves can feel frightening, and I was about to say it's not very complicated, but what I mean is the structure of the vowel quadrilateral itself is nice and simple, in the sense that we can just think about it in terms of the oral cavity itself. So it will indicate how high or low the tongue is. It will indicate how front or back the tongue is, and it will also show us how open or closed the jaw is. So I think that's a really nice place to start, and it only has a finite amount of symbols that you have to get familiar with. If you think it could be useful to learn more of the IPA because you want to be working with accents and you want to have a deeper understanding of that, I really would recommend taking an articulatory phonetics course, or at least familiarizing yourself with some of the resources available. There are actually loads of really great free resources from university linguistics departments. Lots of them have really fantastic resources, but again, because they're designed for linguistics, they can feel a little bit overwhelming at first. But even if you just take just one thing at a time to start with and say, okay, I'm definitely not going to worry about diacritics. I'm not going to look at the suprasegmentals. I'm just going to focus on the vowels. And then I might look at the pulmonic consonants. So you're just choosing the bits that you want to focus on to start with.
Can you just define those, Louisa, what you mean by, I'm going to say, polyfunctional and Sagittarius bits?
Yeah, sure. So the pulmonic consonants are the ones, the majority of the consonants that we make in the Western world are pulmonic. So it means that the breath is coming from the lungs and out of the mouth in order for us to produce the consonants. Non-pulmonic consonants would be things like clicks that we might expect to hear in an African language, for example. Yeah. So that already, if you're only focusing on Western sounds and you're only focusing on what's relevant to me right now within, let's say, the 5 accents I'm likely to come across, if you make a list of them, you're already cutting out quite large chunks of the chart. Diacritics are additional symbols that we can add to the symbols themselves to indicate things like stress, or things like we can add a symbol for rhoticity and things like that. So yes, they are useful, but to begin with, probably don't overwhelm yourself with that and just focus on the pulmonic consonants and then the vowel chart and the vowel quadrilateral. So that would be a really great place to start. If you don't have a great understanding of the anatomy of your vocal tract yet, then do that first. So make sure that your understanding of that is clear, because again, the way that the pulmonic consonant chart is laid out is to do with the manner of articulation and the place of articulation. So if you're not familiar with what a bilabial is, then it's definitely worth making sure that you're clear on your vocal anatomy. And then taking a course on something like articulatory phonetics will help introduce you to how do we now apply that vocal anatomy to these terms that we use primarily in linguistics, but they're useful for us in phonetics. They're useful for us here because we start to understand. It will help you have a much more precise knowledge of exactly where these things are happening. So exactly what the manner of articulation is and the place of articulation for different sounds. And it really helped me when my husband's Welsh, and of course I now live in Wales, but way back when I was first trying to understand some of the Welsh sounds, until I'd looked at my charts and things, I hadn't fully understood how to make the double L, because I was hearing something closer to what sounded to me like, well, I forget now, but a sound that would just, I was way off. I was way off by just listening. And then I looked at how it's actually produced. And then I started to go, okay, all I need to do is follow those instructions. I put my tongue here, I allow the air to travel around the sides of my tongue, and I can make that sound. And now it's pretty good. It's still hard work because it's not a position that my tongue wants to go in naturally. It's not something that I've grown up doing, but I can produce the sound now because I have that precise understanding from things like those charts.
What sort of resources would you recommend? You mentioned some great books earlier. Do you have anything that's sort of top of your list to go to?
For accents specifically or for phonetics?
Either.
I mean, I've got a real fondness. It's ancient and it's massively out of date, but I've got a real fondness for the J.D. O'Connor phonetics book. I really like the way lots of it is structured and phrased, but you do need to be aware that it is really out of date because, of course, accents change, they migrate over time, and you only have to think of a BBC reporter in the 70s and then the 90s and then now to realize that. So it actually having up-to-date resources is crucial in this sort of world, but I really like it. I mentioned the Jan Hayden Rolls and the Edda Sharp How to Do Accents. I really like the Experiencing Accents book, which is from Knight Thompson's speech work. What else? Oh, the Peter Roach phonetics book is really helpful. And then a lot of people like the Paul Meyer book, which is the Accents and Dialects for Stage and Screen. If that appeals to you, it's got some nice functions in it. And of course, a really important resource is the IDEA, the International Dialects of English Archive, which is a fantastic free resource online with stacks and stacks of clips that you can listen to, and some of them even have phonetic transcriptions, which is super, super helpful. The only thing I wish with that is that none of them are videos. And as I've mentioned, I like to really work from starting from a place of observing. So what I tend to do for that is I actually use news clips. So I will go to YouTube and I will search for news reports from local news stations, because then what you usually get are clips of people speaking in a way that is completely unconscious about their voices, but we get a video clip of local regional news, and I find that super, super helpful. So I save loads and loads of those.
Jodie Comer, she is outstanding as an actress anyway. Seeing her in Prima Facie was just a whole body experience. But Her performance as Villanelle in Killing Eve, she moves from one accent to another accent to another accent. I think her home base is Liverpudlian, if I'm not incorrect, but she goes to Russian, French, and German, Italian, and even Australian. So, just for an insight to how you would be working with a coach live, if you like, could you maybe show us how you would get us to start on one of your chosen accents and how to find it in our mouths?
Yeah, sure. To start with, obviously, I would start with recordings and things like that. So we're going to assume that we've done all of that. We've done all of our observational work. We've done our biases work. We've done our listening and looking and that kind of stuff. So let's move to some of the kind of the features of, let's say, a German accent. And I'm choosing that one probably because it's a little bit easier for me because I come from originally my mum's family are German. If I talk about a couple of things that I would identify as features, obviously we're talking about whole language here. So I'm going to focus on specifically my family's region, so that we're talking about in the south, not far from the French border. So it's going to be very, very different from something like up in Berlin, for example. And I just said that in a very English way, Berlin. But if we looked at some of the features of that, one of the issues that I had when I was growing up speaking German and wondering why my cousins couldn't understand me is that in English, we run all of the vowels into the consonants. Everything just kind of runs into one another and we don't really care. It just happens, which is actually one of the reasons why they find it really hard to begin with to understand us. And I was doing the same thing in my spoken German. And I was thinking, well, my vocabulary is fine. So why can't they understand me? And then eventually, when I was about probably 11 or 12, I realized that this is what was happening, that the way that they separate the sounds is different. So I would probably start with working on some glottals with you. So let's say you were someone who weren't familiar with that. We might just start with finding that little sound, and we might use that still hand gesture or whatever it is to make sure that you found that and just find that little sound. And then we might take a sentence or a couple of words that we would typically in English run through. Okay, so let's say an apple. I'd like an apple, please.
I'd like an apple, please.
Yeah, so we run those sounds together. Now, in German, we wouldn't have an apple, we'd have an apple, an apple. So if we could just try that.
An apple.
Yeah, great. Which already sounds a little bit more German. And this is one of the reasons why often people think that German sounds aggressive. That's one of those biases that gets leveled at Germans a lot. We get this kind of staccato sound, yeah, because of this chopping up rather than this kind of fluidity that we might expect to our own ears. Now, the tongue position on the L, on that dark L at the end of apple, for you is closer to that U sound. So we might just move that slightly and just hit it a little harder. So we've got that separation, an apple, and we're going to pull the tip of the tongue further towards the teeth slightly.
An apple.
Good. Okay. And if we think about something like oral posture, okay, so if I think about the specific area that my family are in, again, I'm going to be nice and specific because I'm not talking about any other area. We might maybe just slightly widen the lips. Yeah, that's it. So slightly spreading the lips and have that another go. So we just got that slight, they're not upturned, they're not downturned. It's quite a neutral wide. Yeah.
An apple.
Good. How does that feel?
It's funny because you don't want to impose what you think the accent is going to be like off of, I guess, imitation.
But so much of it is imitation. Yeah. But like you say, what we're doing right now is just about kind of breaking down some of those sounds. So I am not German, although I have German family, I'm not German. So what I can do with you is bring you towards different sounds, but I would never work with my own voice as the source, as the resource for you to work with. I wouldn't say, right, I'm going to record myself doing your lines and give you that to work with. Well, I'm not German. That doesn't make any sense. right? So what we'd do is we'd go, okay, so we've worked on these sounds that we can both identify that we recognize in that accent. We've tried them. Now let's go back and listen to the German accent. Okay, here we go. And obviously we're talking about the German accent speaking English here. So we'd find somebody, we'd find a few different sources and we'd have a listen. Okay, let's get that sound again. Okay, so we're going to imitate that overall sound and then we're going to come back to those individual sounds that we've been working on.
I'm going to be doing that all day. An apple, an apple, an apple.
Yeah,
An
so it's just a little bit more,
uh, uh, uh,
yeah,
an apple.
that's it, because you're wanting to go back to rounded lips.
Oh,
Yeah,
an apple.
that's
I feel very robotic.
yes, and it can feel like that to begin with, but that's just kind of a tiny little moment. Even if all you took from that was the glottals, so that every time you had a sentence and you thought, oh, I can see that vowel, I would normally run that into the consonant. Okay, I need to draw a line, for example. Maybe you don't know the phonetic symbol for the glottal, so I'm going to just draw a line to tell myself to separate it. Even that would help to start make it sound closer to your target accent. And I wouldn't normally do all of those three things at once, by the way. I would spend quite a lot of time on one thing and then layer them. I'm just trying to give you an
Of
example.
course. Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, Louisa, what is next for you? Tell me that you've still got some time for you.
Well, I have probably a complete side tangent, but I have recently taken up ice skating again for the first time since I was a teenager. Yeah, so that's what I do for me. I go every Monday evening to Cardiff and I skate, and that's my time for myself. But most of the week I am working at the Voice Study Centre, and that takes up a lot of my time along with my PhD. And yeah, I've got a few courses coming up that I'll be running with them. I'm partway through at the moment an advanced accent and dialect coaching course, which I'm leading, but we've got loads of really fantastic speakers on that one. So I'm next leading a certificate in acting approaches for singing teachers in August, which is fully online over 8 lunchtime slots. And then I'm teaching a certificate in coaching emotional vocal expression, which starts at the end of September. And then the next accent course I'm running for beginners is in January.
As you mentioned in the beginning, your PhD is around emotion and your research has been fully in that area. And you're writing a paper at the moment, which you are hopefully presenting at a really fun place. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So I've had a paper accepted to present at the VASTA conference in New Orleans in October. Sadly, I can't actually travel over there, so I'm waiting to find out whether or not they'll let me do it on their hybrid day instead. But either way, I'm writing this paper, which is about the influence emotion can have on accents, and when we're in the middle of performing a scene or whatever, how accent just can often get in the way and we fall into those default speech patterns. So that's what I'm investigating at the moment and writing about. But that would probably take an entire session to talk about.
Well, we'll just have to make sure we keep in touch with you and follow all your work. So tell us where we can do that.
Sure. So you can email me if you would like, which is louisa@louisajmorgan.co.uk. I also have a website, louisajmorgan.co.uk, and then you can find me at Voice Study Centre. My email is louisa@voicestudycentre.com, and our website is voicestudycentre.com. So for all of those courses, that's all through Voice Study Centre. If you're interested in contacting me directly about accent coaching or something like that, then you can go to my private email.
Amazing. Oh, Louisa, it's been so lovely to see you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been brilliant. It's been lovely chatting.